Hi, this is John Hanson, and this is another in our series of flipped classroom videos. It's to be viewed only by my students and only for pedagogical and learning purposes related to my class. Its contents may not be shared, copied, recorded, or reproduced by any means or for any purpose. This flipped classroom video begins by briefly summarizing our interdisciplinary approach to studying injustice, looking to the mind sciences, to history, and to law. Based upon that approach, the video highlights a pair of loose predictions regarding how salient injustices will be or have been commonly rationalized. And then the video examines whether those predictions do help explain how three notorious historical injustices were, at the time they occurred, widely and mistakenly perceived as just. They are the Rosewood Massacre, the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, and Japanese internment. Jacob Lipton and I believe that a promising way to study injustice, and therefore justice, is to take an interdisciplinary approach in the hope of triangulating to a better understanding of the roots of injustice. We look, for instance, to research within social psychology and social cognition and other mind sciences to better understand what those subfields have discovered about the psychological processes that lead people to behave unjustly, and what are some common methods of rationalizing injustice. Social psychology, in particular, has for the last century extensively been examining the psychological means and mechanisms of injustice. The Milgram experiments and other shockbox experiments reviewed in earlier flipped classroom videos are only one of many illustrations of this kind of research. But our approach also involves looking backwards to history, to consider the social practices that today everyone more or less agrees represent profound injustices. Our question when studying that history is, how could so many people at some earlier time, that is, those individuals with the most power and capacity to have done something to confront or end the injustice, understand themselves and their systems to be just? How could they have actively engaged in injustice or done so little to advance justice? We look to their mechanisms of rationalization and legitimation to see if, in fact, what mind sciences claim to discover in the laboratory is externally validated by what historians have detailed in their telling of the real-world mechanisms of justification and legitimation throughout history. And of course, we look at the role of the law in producing and, in some instances, ameliorating those injustices. Law is the discipline, more than any other, that must confront routinely the conflicting justice claims of people within our society. That must decide who gets what and who does what when different answers and allocations are plausible. When looking at law, we consider as well legal theory with an eye to those legal theories that are most influential, as well as those that are most critical, to see how they might implicitly or explicitly reflect the insights from mind sciences and the larger historical trends and cultural zeitgeist from which they emerged. But we also suspect law has something to teach those other disciplines. As discussed in class, the big question in law and policy debates has to do with what implicit causal or psychological theory is at the heart of most policy questions or legal decisions. Answers to basic psychological questions regarding who is stick and who is ball play a pivotal role in shaping how one feels about inequalities or suffering. Those attributional stories often serve as a means of rationalizing or legitimating inequalities and injustices. A great deal of theory and evidence from social psychology shows that when we perceive ourselves to be implicated by the suffering or disadvantage of others, particularly when we are in a position of relative advantage and power, we will be motivated to adopt causal stories that leave blame or responsibility on those who are disadvantaged, and to understand ourselves as without meaningful control or influence over the outcome, and therefore not responsible for the suffering. In the shockbox experiments, for instance, teachers tended to assign blame or responsibility to the learner because that causal story justifies the harm to the victim and exonerates the teacher. As I indicated in class, for a variety of reasons, one of the most effective strategies for insulating ourselves and our groups from any sense of responsibility for others' suffering is to frame those disadvantaged groups as others who pose a threat to us, to our stuff, to our way of life, and to our own identity. Such a frame highlights a clear line between us and them, we as allies and they as enemies. It underscores the competitive nature of the intergroup relationship. It suggests the zero-sum quality of the underlying resource over which there is competition, and it characterizes the outgroup, them, as dispositional sticks, acting with selfish maliciousness, and the in-group, us, as situational balls, victims of their malice and aggression, attempting only to defend ourselves and preserve what is rightfully ours. If those lessons from mind sciences have any real-world purchase, then similar dynamics should be found in instances of historical injustice. In other words, history should provide some external validation for the lessons of social psychology. History should reveal not just a few evil individuals knowingly and deliberately engaging in acts of injustice, but many people believing themselves to be advancing justice, unwittingly justifying injustice through their attributional stories, institutional processes, and structural and cultural systems. More specifically, based upon the sorts of social psychological insights summarized previously this semester, Jacob and I have offered two predictions regarding the likely causal stories that would tend to prevail and that would tend to promote injustice. We put predictions in scare quotes here to alert our audience that they should be quite suspicious of any suggestion that we're making here that ours is a rigorous scientific theory that draws theoretical lessons from social sciences from which a set of logical predictions are then produced, predictions that are only then tested against the data. It's plain to us, and should be to our audience, that there is a bias and motivation at play in every stage of this project. For instance, the stories we've read, heard, and studied regarding historical events no doubt have influenced our so-called predictions. If history is our test, we're looking backwards to discern explanations for certain practices, not looking forward predicting those practices or outcomes. Similarly, our so-called predictions and our desire to confirm those predictions have likely shaped what evidence we look to and how we interpreted that evidence. Still, all that said, we persist in using that problematic model both because we've made a good faith effort to do exactly what we suspect is impossible to do perfectly: derive predictions and test them against the evidence as provided by historians, and also because we don't believe our own biases are greater than those of most scholars who developed and test theories to explain or understand social phenomena, and we've opted to frame our argument within the structures of dominant epistemic norms so that we might better engage, challenge, and respond to other theorists who do so. Anyway, in terms of our predictions, we first predicted that individuals who were disadvantaged will have been perceived in history, particularly by the advantaged, as inferior or bad sticks, and held responsible for their own inequality or suffering, even though closer examination would reveal that they are more like balls, being moved by situation, systems, institutions, stereotypes, and the like. And second, we predicted that individuals who are advantaged will tend to be perceived, particularly by the advantaged, as equal or good sticks. If they are harmed and when they harm others, they will tend to be viewed with compassion and as balls, and therefore not responsible, or at least not to blame, for those harms. To test those simple predictions against history, we will take several approaches. First, we will consider a number of relatively discrete events in history that, at least in hindsight, have come to be understood in the larger cultures as egregiously unjust, and ask how could such unjust practices or outcomes have been tolerated at the time by people who considered themselves moral and just. This video takes up some of those examples. Second, we will look to larger macro-level injustices that have been continuously embedded or visible in virtually all social contexts, for instance, white supremacy or patriarchy or speciesism, and consider how the macro rationalizations have evolved in the U.S. over the last several centuries. The first set of specific injustices should, of course, be consistent with or instances of this second set of general frames for justifying injustice. And third, we will, as we have already begun to do, look at individual legal cases and opinions within those larger frames to see if they might reveal the same dynamics in law that we are arguing are playing out throughout the culture, and how the law might contribute to those dynamics. Again, this flipped classroom video looks to the first kind of evidence. That is, it considers the lessons that might be drawn from what are widely perceived as several of the country's most shameful practices, moments that today are universally understood as instances of clear injustice. We focus on examples of reparations because in the remarkably few instances in which subsequent generations have opted to acknowledge and repair the injustices of prior generations, that very act is, by definition, an acknowledgement of an injustice on the part of those in power, an admission of wrongdoing in an attempt to make repair. Of course, the admission may be decades or centuries too late, and the repair or compensation might in fact be quite shallow and incomplete. Regardless, we look to those moments because they represent instances in which there is no disagreement, no controversy that an injustice has been done. We look to examples of reparations as well because of the remarkable overlap that they share with tort law, its purpose, its effects, and its methods. So what about reparations? Prior to 2015, there'd actually only been 4 instances of reparations in the U.S. There were reparations in North Carolina to victims of eugenics and forced sterilization programs. There were reparations from Florida to victims of the Rosewood Massacre. There were reparations by the U.S. government to victims of the Tuskegee experiment. And there were U.S. reparations to victims of Japanese internment policies. In this flipped classroom video, we will review the last 3 of those examples because the first example is discussed in another flipped classroom video. So we turn now to the second injustice, the second example of reparations on our list. The Rosewood Massacre was just one example of what was a depressingly common story during the Jim Crow era, and in particular between 1917 and 1923, a time when racially motivated mob violence erupted in nearly 25 cities around the U.S., including major well-known riots and massacres in East St. Louis and in Tulsa. It was a time period when lynchings of blacks were also spiking. In Florida alone, there were 47 lynchings of black citizens between 1918 and 1927. Prior to the Rosewood Massacre, the little town, Rosewood, had been a relatively successful and independent black community, the home to around 200 black residents with very few white residents. In fact, the success and relative independence of Rosewood and its citizens had been the source of some resentment by whites in the area. In January of 1923, a mob of white men stormed Rosewood, sparked by a report from Fannie Taylor, a 22-year-old white woman who lived in the nearby town of Sumner. The wife and mother of 2 had been visibly beaten, and she alleged that the culprit had been an unidentified black man. She emphasized to authorities that she had been beaten, but not raped. Now, circulating at the time and unresolved by historians since were other plausible accounts of Fannie's visible bruises and injuries, including that Fannie's husband or lover had beaten her. Nonetheless, Fannie's story was what many in her community apparently wanted to hear, and the story very quickly transformed into one in which she had been both beaten and raped. In response, the local sheriff raised a posse and started an investigation. Quickly, matters escalated out of his control as several hundred white men arrived to assist in a search for someone to punish. It was not long before whites headed to Rosewood, where a young black man, Aaron Carrier, was taken from his home and tied to a car and dragged to Sumner, where the sheriff placed him in protective custody. Soon another had been tortured and then lynched. The killing and violence continued as the mob began setting fire to the buildings in Rosewood. Some of the residents of Rosewood fought back, but many escaped the violence by seeking refuge in the woods and nearby swamps. Eventually, hundreds of white men from surrounding areas arrived and participated in the destruction of Rosewood. In the process, several African Americans, at least half a dozen, but some have estimated as many as 20, were killed, as were 2 whites, and many more were injured. Over the course of those days, virtually all of Rosewood's buildings were burned to the ground, including homes, a church, a Masonic hall, and a store. Although newspapers, some local and some from the north, paid close attention to the violence while the bullets flew and fire raged, the reports tended to be highly unreliable and hyperbolic. No paper carefully or extensively chronicled what happened at the time. In fact, it would take half a century before a few people would begin agitating to bring those events to light, and 7 decades before the state of Florida would be moved to investigate what had happened. The report pictured here is a product of that effort. Part of what made the Rosewood Massacre stand out in the late 20th century was not that a black community had been terrorized during the Jim Crow era, that was all too common, but that the black community, the people and the buildings, had been so totally dispersed and destroyed. The town had been literally wiped off the map, and the events themselves had been more or less erased from many people's spoken memories until the late 20th century. That began to change in the 1970s. And in 1983, in response to one local journalist's ongoing research on the topic, Ed Bradley from the CBS News magazine 60 Minutes did a story on the Rosewood Massacre. The 60 Minutes segment gave the massacre national attention for the first time and pressured officials in the state of Florida to pay some attention to it. Bradley interviewed several individuals who witnessed the growing mob and its violence.
And then that mob grew in size, it grew in anger, and it became even more violent.
You ain't never seen a mob like that.
Fred Kirkland was a teenager when he saw the mob rampaging through Rosewood.
They went wild. There was 1,000 to 1,500 people there by that time, and they're coming in from every direction. And they was crazy. They give the high sheriff and the deputy 5 minutes to get out of sight and not come back.
They told the sheriff and the deputy to get out of town and not come back?
Get out of there. Give them 5 minutes to get out of sight.
And what did the sheriff and the deputy do?
They left there. And then they went to burning houses, killing people you never seen.
Yeah, Sunday morning they came through here, setting houses on fire. And as each one ran out, they'd shoot them, kill them. And there was a colored woman right here, lived just across here in the woods from me. And her name was Lexi Gordon, and she was sick. She had typhoid fever. And when she told the ones that was staying there with her for them to go ahead and get away if they could, well, she'd just take whatever come. Well, naturally, when they set the house afire, well, she ran out towards the back. And she had a back door, Johnny, out there, and so she made for it. And they shot her before she got there.
But she had nothing to
do with it at all, whatever. And, well, it was the way with a lot of them, you see. That was the reason it was such a situation that we just couldn't understand. It was just a mad bunch of men come in here.
What do you think they got out of it? Why did they do it?
Motive, I guess. Satisfaction is all I can figure it out. I don't know what it was.
Satisfaction.
I reckon that was it.
Well, the whole place was in smoke around here, And they said they had destroyed all the buildings. And said that there would be no more to live here no more, They couldn't come back and live.
Ultimately, the black residents of Rosewood, who survived and were driven from the area, were unable to return. Instead, the charred land was later acquired by whites, who got the land at a bargain merely by paying the delinquent taxes on the property. No whites were prosecuted, much less held accountable. And again, no one discussed the incident for decades, at least not in public places. As the Rosewood report made very clear, racist and dehumanizing stereotypes were at the heart of the massacre. The report put it this way: underscoring much of the racial hostility were stereotypes and misconceptions that pervaded white America. Whites believed that blacks were mentally inferior, immoral, emotional, and criminal. Some secondary beliefs were that they were innately lazy, shiftless, boisterous, bumptious, and lacking in civic consciousness. Many whites accepted these racial rationalizations because they wanted to, and their newspapers reinforced such attitudes by publishing stories that highlighted black crimes and immoral behavior, and by seldom reporting positively about the daily lives of black citizens. Many whites had such a low opinion of blacks that they were prepared to treat them in the most inhumane fashion whenever they felt themselves threatened by the minority. It's easy to discern from this the use of the "they are a threat to us" imagery. According to the report, the perceived threats were heightened in this time period for several reasons. During World War I, the arming and training of black soldiers in the South heightened fears among whites regarding the tendency and capacity of blacks to fight back. And additionally, German propaganda added considerably to white anguish, calling on African Americans to lay down their arms or turn them against their real enemies, Southern whites. According to the report, rumors also circulated in 1918 that black soldiers had been warmly received in Europe and had had their way with white women in France. Back home, white militants warned that black veterans would no longer be content with black women when they returned from Europe. As will become clear, one of the most common and successful means of eliciting a sense of threat and mobilizing violent mobs throughout U.S. history is to specify the threat that they pose to us is one of sexual predation of our young women and children. In 1915, as well, the infamous silent movie The Birth of a Nation, originally called The Klansman, came out in theaters and would soon become one of the most watched and most influential films in U.S. history. One that portrayed black men as unintelligent and sexually aggressive towards white women, and one that presented the Ku Klux Klan as a heroic force and helped to inspire the formation of the second era of the Ku Klux Klan. Locally, according to the Rosewood Report, the experience of such fears and perception of such threats were especially heightened because on New Year's Day 1923, just a couple of days before the Rosewood Massacre, the KKK had held a parade and rally in nearby Gainesville at which over 100 hooded Klansmen marched and hung under a burning cross a banner that read, "First and always protect womanhood." One can get some idea of what were the dominant racial attitudes and stories of the day by considering the positions of Governor Sidney Johnston Katz, who had been elected in 1917 on a platform that was anti-Catholic and anti-black, and had publicly labeled black residents as part of an inferior race. He came to power in part by activating the "they pose a threat to us" artifice. At the onset of World War I, Governor Katz attempted to exploit the swollen anti-German sentiment to further his own anti-Catholic and racist agendas. He publicly theorized that the monks of St. Leo Abbey near Tampa, many of whom were either German Americans or German immigrants, were planning to arm Florida's African American community for a popular revolt in favor of Kaiser Wilhelm II, after which Pope Benedict XV, who was a well-documented pacifist, who was Italian and not German, would take over Florida and move the Holy See to nearby San Antonio and close all of the Protestant churches. This far-fetched fear-mongering conspiracy theory actually caused a number of German settlers to move to friendlier parts of the country. Revealingly, Governor Katz refused to criticize 2 lynchings in 1919, and when the NAACP complained, Katz responded by denouncing the organization and blacks generally. "Your race is always harping on the disgrace it brings to the state by a concourse of white people taking revenge for the dishonoring of a white woman, when if you would teach your people not to kill our white officers and disgrace our white women, you would keep down 1,000 times greater disgrace." In a way, the governor was claiming, "You're the sticks here. We are simply responding to the threat that your group poses to us. If you don't like our responses, stop attacking us." And the same theme was echoed by local journalists, including editors of the Gainesville Daily Sun, who offered the same blame-attributing narratives in response to the Rosewood Massacre itself. Words cannot express the horror of the tragedy at Sumner and Rosewood in Levy County. A brutish Negro made a criminal assault on an unprotected white girl. As a result of this, 2 officers of the law were killed and another wounded. 5 or 6 Negroes were killed and many others wounded. Houses were burned. Indignation, vengeance, and terror ran riot. We do not know how to write about it. We feel too indignant just now to write with calm judgment, and we shall wait a little while. One thing, however, we shall say now, in whatever state it may be, law or no law, courts or no courts, as long as criminal assaults on innocent women continue, lynch law will prevail, and blood will be shed. The editor's wrath was so visceral that as late as Saturday, 5 days after the attack on Fannie Taylor, the editor claimed to be unable to comment about it, even as he did manage to justify the massacre itself by suggesting that the whites were without a choice and that their reaction to the assault on innocent women was unavoidable and perhaps appropriate. Later the son would make the point this way: "Let it be understood now and forever that he, whether white or black, who brutally assaults an innocent and helpless woman shall die the death of a dog." This story seems to illustrate the basic lessons of social psychology that those in power will tend to engage in both motivated strategies. That is, attributing blame to the outgroup, the victim, by characterizing them as malicious sticks, and exonerating themselves, members of the in-group, by seeing themselves as mere balls. If we consider how those stories and reactions correspond to the lessons of the shock box experiments, the parallels seem pretty clear. Recall Phil Zimbardo's experiment, for instance, that showed how disidentification, including a change in one's external appearance, can trigger changes in overt behavior. More specifically, his research showed how when our identities are insulated, distanced, hidden, or dissociated from the consequences of our actions, we are more willing to inflict harm and to commit injustices. The effect of KKK membership, the hoods, the mob mentality, and the conspiracy of silence all contribute to those tendencies. Those same effects of disidentification are, I suspect, widely understood, which is part of why anonymity through masks and mobs could be so terrorizing, and why those who engage in organized violence often prepare themselves by employing various forms of disidentification and group association. Recall also the classic experiment conducted by Albert Bandura and his colleagues. He found that when learners were dehumanized, as was the case here, subjects seldom condemned punitive techniques but often voiced self-absolving justifications. Recall the experiment conducted by Melvin Lerner and Carolyn Simmons in 1966. Their results illustrated two ways in which individuals cope with witnessing suffering. We either stop the injustice, or we justify it by conceiving of the victim as a person who actually deserves to suffer. That disposition illusion quickly and easily satisfies our yearning for justice by changing our perception of the victim's disposition, and it's a quicker and cheaper fix than attempting to address the situation that is creating the suffering or acknowledging our own connection to that situation. You might wonder about whether and how the legal system responded to the Rosewood Massacre, a set of events that in every way would seem to have violated the most basic, most essential, and most cherished elements of our legal system, including the key pillars of what we've come to call the cathedral. State leaders in 1923 feared that the negative press regarding the violence might harm the state's tourist industry. In response, then-Governor Kerry Hardy appointed a special grand jury and special prosecuting attorney to investigate the outbreak in Rosewood. In February of 1923, an all-white grand jury convened in Bronson. According to the Rosewood report, the presiding judge implored the grand jury, which was made up of farmers and merchants, to make every effort to fix the blame where it belonged and to see that the guilty parties are brought to justice. But the grand jury concluded that there was, quote, insufficient evidence, end quote, to prosecute anyone. Ultimately, many residents of Rosewood had been killed or seriously injured, and even the survivors had had their property stolen from them, including their homes and businesses. In the process, their community and their shared history and their future was destroyed. When Ed Bradley interviewed some of the living survivors of the massacre, this is how they described the experience.
I'm bringing back memory that I wished I could get rid of. You know what I mean? This has been a hobby. If you just had been here to listen to all this and see some of it, then you would have known just what it was. We lost everything.
Lost everything.
You own the land.
Yeah, we own our land, all of them.
And no one ever paid you any money for this land?
No,
Just lost it.
took it.
Yes, they lost everything, but they didn't just lose their property. Powerful actors and interests, with the support of the legal system, took their property from them. Let's take a look at the third specific example of a recognized injustice, an instance of oppression in which future generations concluded that reparations were appropriate. That is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Between 1932 and 1972 in Tuskegee, Alabama, the United States Public Health Service studied the natural progression of untreated syphilis in black American men who thought they were receiving free health care from their government. The test subjects were never told that they had syphilis and they were never treated for it. According to the Centers for Disease Control, the men were told they were being treated for bad blood. Well, the Tuskegee study failed all ethical standards, including the 1947 Nuremberg Code, protecting the legal rights of research subjects and prohibiting human experimentation. This study was especially upsetting because the subject's syphilis was deliberately left unnamed and untreated, even after penicillin was known to cure it, so that scientists could study the progression of the disease. Subjects were left to degenerate under the ravages of syphilis, including heart disease, tumors, paralysis, blindness, insanity, and early death. In the end, 28 men died of syphilis, 100 men died from related complications, at least 40 wives were infected with the disease, and 19 children contracted congenital syphilis at birth, all of it, or much of it, needlessly. Historian James Jones wrote what has become the definitive history of the Tuskegee experiments. He understood his task as attempting to figure out how this could have happened, how, in other words, a profession dedicated to advancing human health could stand so firmly, so publicly, and so long in defense of such a heinous experiment. As he would discover, the story would become a case study in how one violates just about everything one can violate that is moral in medicine. In providing historical context for the study, Jones explained the evolution of the general attitudes and presumptions of medical doctors, explaining that white physicians of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries blamed the decline in black health on self-destructive behavioral traits. According to Jones, doctors after the Civil War embraced strong stereotypes about African Americans, believing, among other things, that African Americans, without the paternalistic control of slavery, would be left to their own devices, and their lifestyles would be ruinous, and they would not take care of their health and would be easy targets for infectious diseases. According to Jones, the stereotypes provided the causal stories that allowed the profession to place responsibility on blacks who suffered from syphilis, among other illnesses. In his words, disparaging statements about blacks as patients and the inability of education to improve their health fixed the responsibility for the state of black health solely on blacks themselves. No disease seemed more suited to blacks than syphilis, for physicians were certain that exaggerated libido and widespread sexual promiscuity had led to a high incidence of the disease among blacks. Again, we hear echoes of the Lerner and Simmons experiment. The content of the stereotypes, writes Jones, included the black man's distaste for honest labor, fondness for alcohol, proclivity to crime and sexual vices, disregard for personal hygiene, ignorance of the laws of good nutrition, and total indifference to his own health. To some, syphilis was seen as deserved, a form of natural justice. Syphilis was nature's justice, and it satisfied the general motive to believe that outcomes, including diseases, are deserved and the world is just. Jones explains, some physicians of the day were overtly judgmental and spoke of blacks as having earned their illnesses as just recompense for wicked lifestyles. This preoccupation with personal responsibility for disease assured syphilis a prominent place in the medical discussion of black health. What better example of just retribution could be offered than the philanderer who contracted syphilis? In other words, syphilis became powerful evidence that supported the motivated belief that the health challenges of the black community could be blamed on the person, because the incidence of this disease when African Americans are the carriers reveals something about the character of the people. At the same time, such dispositionist stereotypes help to relieve any dissonance that physicians may have felt. After all, what difference could doctors make in terms of enhancing or harming the health of patients when the patients themselves are so careless and recalcitrant? Jones writes, by defining the black health problem in racial terms, physicians, whose services were often beyond the reach of the poor, absolved themselves of responsibility for what they saw as the Negro's deterioration. Attributing failure to the irresponsible victim was much easier on the profession's pride and permitted physicians to exercise a certain self-righteousness in their pronouncements. In so many ways, these stereotypes justified the indifference to the suffering black patients. The result was a powerful rationale for inactivity in the face of disease, which by their own estimates, physicians believed to be endemic. At the same time, admit that any harms caused by the study would not really be so different from the self-inflicted harm that these subjects would likely have experienced anyway. Moreover, the stereotypes and the indifference that the stereotypes rationalized contribute to a cycle that would itself lead to outcomes that would confirm the stereotypes. Jones makes and draws a similar conclusion, writing, "The effect of those views was to isolate blacks even further within American society, to remove them from the world of health, and to lock them within a person of sickness. Whether by accident or design, physicians had come dangerously close to depicting the syphilitic black as the representative black. And as sickness replaced health as the normal condition of the race, something was lost from the sense of horror and urgency with which physicians had defined the disease." Largely for those reasons, when it came time to conduct the syphilis experiments, Tuskegee, Alabama, and Macon County was targeted precisely because of its mostly black population and its poverty. The study's leading doctor, Dr. Tolliver Clark, argued, "Macon County is a natural laboratory, a ready-made situation. The rather low intelligence of the Negro population, depressed economic conditions, and the very common promiscuous sex relations not only contribute to the spread of syphilis, but also to the prevailing indifference with regard to treatment." And to conduct the study, Dr. Clark and the people he enlisted to carry out the experiment had to tell a series of lies to local doctors, local ministers, and to the subjects themselves. The actual subjects for the research came from the least advantaged groups, the most vulnerable groups, those most in need of the benefits that they were told that they would receive, including free testing and treatment for the problem of so-called bad blood. After conducting the initial round of blood tests, the Public Health Service engaged in a stage that they called the roundup, a dehumanizing reference to describe the gathering of subjects, like cattle, to participate in the study. The procedures that subjects would undergo at that second stage were painful and dangerous, including spinal taps. To participate, subjects had to be more or less duped into agreeing through a variety of mechanisms. Potential subjects, for instance, received this letter containing these inducements to participate in the study. "Some time ago you were given a thorough examination, and since that time we hope you have gotten a great deal of treatment," the letter offered. "You will now be given your last chance to get a second examination. This examination is a very special one, and after it is finished you will be given a special treatment. Because we expect to be so busy, it may be necessary for you to remain in the hospital over one night. If this is necessary, you will be furnished your meals and a bed, as well as the examination and treatment without cost." The letter ended, "Remember, this is your last chance for a special free treatment." Other inducements to consent and continue participation included not information, but free medicines, burial assistance or insurance, free hot meals on the days of examination, transportation to and from the hospital, and an opportunity to stop in town on the return trip. The very stereotypes that were employed to characterize the subjects of the study and to justify the study were employed to justify all the lying and deception along the way. For instance, Dr. Clark saw the lying and deception as a plus, as it meant that researchers could do their work more easily. In his words, "These Negroes are very ignorant and easily influenced by things that would be of minor significance in a more intelligent group." Again, here we can see the lessons of the shock box experiments, including the tendency to disparage those whose free choice is being manipulated and whose health is being harmed, as well as the tendency to trivialize and minimize the actual harms done to such victims. The original study was supposed to last only 6 months. That would be an underestimate by roughly 40 years. During the extended span of time, there would be remarkable advancements in medicine, including a cure to syphilis, that is, penicillin. But that cure was nowhere provided to the subjects in the experiment. The subjects, again, weren't even told the name of their disease, much less that it might have been easily cured. This video clip from the documentary Deadly Deception describes how the study's leaders managed to rationalize their study, even as its deadly consequences for its subjects became increasingly clear.
John Heller had replaced Von der Leer as the director of the Tuskegee study.
More than 200,000 new infections of syphilis are acquired in this country each year. All are actually or potentially highly infectious.
On the basis of present evidence, Penicillin appears to have great value in the treatment of syphilis in virtually all stages and manifestations.
Whatever the future may hold for penicillin therapy, we physicians already have in our hands weapons which, with proper medical usage, should enable us to reduce materially the amount of venereal disease in the United States.
While promoting penicillin for the nation, Heller continued the policy of denying treatment to the men in Macon County. In 1947, he published the latest findings from the study in the Journal of Venereal Disease Information.
The life expectancy of a Negro man between 25 and 50 who is infected with syphilis and receives no treatment is reduced by about 20%. The fact that nearly twice as large a proportion of the syphilitic individuals as of the control group has died is a very striking one.
Even with undisputed evidence that men were dying, no penicillin was offered.
The Tuskegee study in this sense had much in common with the Milgram experiment, in which the subjects, as teachers, continued to give shocks to learners no matter how deadly, in the name of science. The doctors in the study, not to mention the medical and public health professionals reading Dr. Heller's publications about the study, seemed never to notice the obvious injustice. But differently, it was as if the subjects in the study were just that. They were subjects and not humans, that they were outside the profession's scope of justice. Dr. Heller, who had overseen the study for some years, would later defend the experiment against criticism, stating that there was nothing in the experiment that was unethical or unscientific. Heller's rationalization went on to mirror the justifications offered by the shock box subjects. Heller explained, for the most part, doctors and civil servants simply did their jobs. Some merely followed orders. Others worked for the glory of science. In Milgram's experiments, recall, subjects routinely assigned responsibility to the learner and not themselves. As one subject put it, I merely went on because I was following orders. I was told to go on, and I did not get a cue to stop. Another explained, in the interest of science, one goes through with it. Dr. John Cutler was the acting chief of the venereal disease program in the United States Public Health Service after Dr. Heller. Across his career, he was involved in several controversial and unethical medical studies, including the Guatemala and Tuskegee syphilis experiments. This video captures Dr. Cutler's justification for continuing the experiment, which was that whatever the impact of the experiment for individual subjects, the study was very valuable for science and for helping the communities from which the subjects came.
My regret is, in terms of the study, I have none. We were dealing with a very important study that was going to have the long-term results of which were actually to improve the quality of care for the black community, so that these individuals were actually contributing to the work towards the improvement of the health of the black community rather than simply serving as merely guinea pigs for the study. And of course, I was bitterly opposed to cutting off the study for obvious reasons.
The study in that way was seen as serving bigger purposes to help disadvantaged groups and to advance science, and the benefits of those bigger goals transcended any cost that the study might have had on those men who were deceived, who suffered needlessly, and who died prematurely. But what about the fact that a simple cure was in hand, penicillin, that cure was being denied to these very men even when they sought it out? Dr. Cutler offers this rationalizing evasion.
It was important. They were supposedly untreated, and it would be undesirable to go ahead and use large amounts of penicillin to treat another disease because you'd interfere with the study.
So confident was Dr. Cutler in his beliefs that he was all too happy to defend his decisions here on camera, and to do so with a fairly obvious and seemingly unshakable confidence and self-righteousness. What is revealed is a way of seeing the harms, a frame or causal narrative or attributional story that made the 40 years of duplicity, deception, and harm seem like the right and the just thing. How was that possible? Simple. Those conducting the experiment created dehumanizing categories that allowed them to legitimate the suffering and justify the experiment. As James Jones explained, the men's status did not warrant ethical debate. They were subjects, not patients, clinical material, not sick people. Or as we might put it, the victims were, as black subjects in a scientific experiment, viewed as outside the scope of justice. As noted above, John Cutler led a related set of syphilis experiments in Guatemala from 1946 to 1948. In those experiments, the doctors infected soldiers, prostitutes, prisoners, and mental patients with syphilis and other sexually transmitted disease without the informed consent of the subjects. The experiment resulted in at least 83 deaths. If you're interested in learning more, you can watch the 2018 tort report at the tiny URL Guatemalan Syphilis Experiment. Finally, we turn to the fourth acknowledged injustice for which reparations have been made. That is the forced relocation and incarceration in internment camps of about 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of whom lived on the Pacific coast during World War II. In 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which permitted the Secretary of War to arrest and incarcerate Japanese, Germans, and Italians who had been declared enemy aliens. In 1942, pursuant to that order, 120,000 Japanese, 62% of them American-born, were forcibly evacuated from the Pacific coast and incarcerated. The enemy aliens, as they were known, were arrested and held without charges or trials, and their homes, farms, and businesses could be seized without warning. After Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and the U.S. entered the Second World War, a number of very powerful interest groups from Western states, including nativist groups, pressured Congress and the President to remove persons of Japanese descent from the West Coast. The heightened fear and sense of threat created by the surprise attack on Hawaii was an understandable contributor to that effort. But as historians have shown, the racist attitudes had long been pretty widespread on the West Coast. For example, in 1900, Dr. Edward Ellsworth Ross, a famous professor of economics at Stanford, wrote this of the Japanese: "They are unassimilable, they work for low wages and thereby undermine the existing work standards of American workmen. Their standards of living are much lower than American workmen, and they lack proper political feeling for American democratic institutions." Dr. Ross might have said, in other words, that they are the French Canadians of the West. Similarly, in 1922, when testifying before Congress regarding immigration policy, Ulysses S. Webb, California's Attorney General, testified before Congress saying of Asians, particularly Chinese and Japanese, that they are different in color, different in ideals, different in race, different in ambitions, different in their theory of political economy and government. They speak a different language. They worship another god. They have not in common with the Caucasian a single trait. Many of the attitudes towards the Japanese had arisen from economic factors combined with envy. Many of the Japanese farmers had become very successful in business and farming. At the time in California, Japanese and Japanese Americans were a considerable force within agriculture, often having transformed land that was previously considered unarable to produce 30 to 40% of the state's truckable crops. That was some of the larger context in which, on February 19, 1942, FDR issued Executive Order 906, authorizing exclusion and providing in part, "Whereas the successful prosecution of the war requires every possible protection against espionage and against sabotage to national defense material, I hereby authorize the Secretary of War, whenever he deems such action necessary, to prescribe military areas in such places as he may determine, from which any or all persons may be excluded, and with respect to which the right of any person to enter, remain in, or leave shall be subject to whatever restrictions the Secretary of War may impose in his discretion." Note that through that order, FDR was not only giving discretion to the Secretary of War, he was also attempting to absolve himself of being the one to decide to enact such policies. He didn't call for the policy, he merely turned that question over to another actor, who arguably had more expertise and knowledge of the relevant factors, even as he was quite confident regarding what would be the consequences of the order. On March 21, 1942, pursuant to the decision of the Secretary of War, Congress implemented the plan by passing Public Law 503. The result of the order was that people of Japanese descent were required to gather a limited amount of their belongings and leave the remainder of their possessions and their homes, and follow instructions to various depots to board trains or trucks or buses for unknown destinations. The images that follow capture some of what these Japanese Americans experienced as they were transported to unfamiliar spaces and herded into concentration camps in Arkansas, California, Oregon, Washington, Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona, Utah, and Idaho. Each of those camps was surrounded by fences and guarded by armed forces. As mentioned above, the anti-Japanese fears were heightened after the devastating Japanese attack of Pearl Harbor, in which more than 2,300 U.S. military personnel were killed and more than 1,100 were wounded, and 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed. Frank Knox, Roosevelt's Secretary of Navy at the time, blamed Pearl Harbor not on lack of preparation, but on the most effective fifth column work that's come out of this war, except in Norway. The fact that there was never any evidence of any sort of domestic espionage or planning for Pearl Harbor or otherwise was interpreted as confirmation of how effective the Japanese were. The widespread concern was captured by a cartoonist with whom you were quite familiar. Theodore Geisel, the editorial cartoonist, published a drawing showing hordes of buck-toothed American Japanese collecting dynamite, waiting for the signal to use it. Geisel signed the cartoon under his well-known pseudonym, Dr. Seuss. The Mutual Broadcasting Company, one of the best-known American commercial radio networks, charged that the Japanese engaged in espionage and warned of dangers posed by the Japanese domination of food production in California. Anti-Japanese sentiment in the media was typified by dispositionist editorials like this one from the Los Angeles Times. A viper is nonetheless a viper wherever the egg is hatched. So a Japanese American born of Japanese parents grows up to be a Japanese, not an American. Again, here we see the role of dehumanizing dispositionist stereotypes to justify the hatred and, in turn, the exertion of state power of the sort that would otherwise clearly contradict our system's most fundamental and sacred values. And to be sure, there were some who were resisting the stereotypes and calling upon the public to remember our national values. Eleanor Roosevelt, for instance, wrote in her nationally syndicated newspaper column as follows: "This is perhaps the greatest test this country has ever met. Our citizens come from all nations of the world. If we cannot meet the challenge of fairness to our citizens of every nationality, of really believing in the Bill of Rights and making it a reality for all loyal American citizens, regardless of race, creed, or color, if we cannot keep in check anti-Semitism, anti-racial feelings, as well as anti-religious feelings, then we shall have removed the one real hope for the future on which all humanity must now rely." Prominent columnist Henry McLemore expressed his own dissonance between national values and nativist urges as follows: "I know this is a melting pot of the world and all men are created equal and there must be no such thing as race or creed hated. But do these things go when a country is fighting for its life? Here, in other words, the situational exigencies of the moment justify relinquishing the values that we otherwise purport to hold dear. We are but a ball because they are attacking us." This should again remind you of the subjects in the shock box experiments who similarly explained away why they continue to shock the learner. One subject said, "There was I'm a nice person, I think, hurting somebody and caught up in what seemed a mad situation, and in the interest of science, one goes through with it." In explaining why he was laughing during the experiment, another subject offered this situational excuse. "This was a sheer reaction to a totally impossible situation, and my reaction was to the situation of having to hurt somebody and being totally helpless and caught up in a set of circumstances where I just couldn't deviate. I could not try to help." So the subject saw himself as a ball caught in a situational bind with no alternative and no ability to resist commands. By perceiving himself as a ball, the subject could absolve himself of responsibility for the action, just as Henry Macklemore suggested there was no choice but to forcefully relocate the Japanese. These tendencies were evident as well in Albert Bandura's experiment. Bandura's subjects who were in the dehumanization condition and who tended therefore to give higher shocks also tended to exonerate themselves by attributing punitive behavior to their situation, not their disposition, saying things like, "If doing my job as a superior means I must be a son of a bitch, so be it." When it came down to it, Macklemore seemed not to be so troubled by the prospect of the Japanese Americans having to suffer, nor did he seem to require a war justification to reach his conclusion. As he put it, "I am for immediate removal of the Japanese on the West Coast to a point deep in the interior. I don't mean a nice part of the interior either. Herd 'em up, pack 'em off, and give 'em the inside room in the Badlands. Personally, I hate the Japanese, and that goes for all of them. Let 'em be pinched, hurt, hungry, and dead up against it." In several ways, we see how Macklemore has removed the Japanese from the category of human who is entitled to justice. Again, in Bandura's experiment, we saw subjects who tended to exonerate themselves by attributing more culpability to their victims, saying things like, "People are basically evil and have to be put in their place." As Sam Keane described in his now classic book, Faces of the Enemy, we invent a version of the enemy and then manufacture hate for the enemy when we go to war in order to help us go to war and to justify our actions when we do so.
All nations use basically the same visual metaphors, the same hostile cliches to characterize and dehumanize their enemies. It's as if all these propaganda artists had gone to the same art school. The enemy is always a demon, a barbarian, the aggressor, a liar, a madman, or some vile animal that can be exterminated without regret. Before we make war, even before we make weapons, we make an idea of the enemy.
Much as the animated faces are constructed to serve our motives, so too are our dispositionist stereotypes. Through both words and images, the message was clear at the time that the Japanese posed a major threat as a ruthless and animalistic enemy. One editorialist described the racial disposition of Japanese as both cultural and biological, and in any event, treacherous. Japanese males are taught by their elders to look upon American girls with a view to sex relations. The proposed assimilation of the two races is unthinkable. It is morally indefensible and biologically impossible. Those messages, like this one, sought to heighten the sense of threat by indicating that the ultimate goal of these non-human monsters was to victimize our young, white, and pure women. Again, history suggests that this threat is one of the most galvanizing and thus commonly employed. Of course, there were other forms of explicit dehumanization. A common theme was one of depicting Japanese and other Asian immigrants as rats and rodents. This poster illustrates that tendency, as do the words of Governor Chase Clark when he resisted an internment policy that would send Japanese to his state. "The Japs," he said, "live like rats, breed like rats, and act like rats. I don't want them coming to Idaho." It should be emphasized that not all of the law's supporters held such outrageous views or traded in such dehumanizing stereotypes. In fact, many of the most influential California politicians supported internment, even when their arguments did not rely so heavily upon such ugly imagery. Then Governor Colbert Olson conceded that the policy had problems and was over-inclusive, but concluded that even if not all Japanese were seen as equally threatening, the indistinguishability of Japanese meant they nonetheless had to be treated alike. As he put it, because of the extreme difficulty in distinguishing between loyal Japanese Americans, I believe in the wholesale evacuation of the Japanese people from coastal California. So yes, the governor was giving voice to a widely held viewpoint of any in-group, foremost out-groups, that they all look alike. But such a position does not resonate with the more shameful attitudes for which internment is better known. In that way, the seemingly more moderate leaders, employing less offensive stereotypes, played a key role in enacting and justifying an unjust policy, just as subjects in Milgram's experiment who attempted to persuade the experimenter to stop the experiment, as they nonetheless continued to administer shocks to the learner, were no less linked to the apparent harms than were those subjects who continued shocking without hesitancy. Consider, too, the role of California's then Attorney General Earl Warren, who organized the state's civilian defense program and became an outspoken proponent for internment, warning in January 1942 that the Japanese situation as it exists in the state today may well be the Achilles heel of the entire civilian defense effort. Historians have pointed out that Warren's advocacy played a major role in providing public legitimation for the policy of forcefully dispossessing, relocating, and incarcerating Japanese Americans. In other words, the very same Earl Warren who was a driving force behind the internment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans without any formal charges or due process was, roughly a decade later, the author of Brown v. Board of Education as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Warren would soon come to regret that role, eventually writing a kind of apology in his memoirs, explaining that he deeply regretted the removal order and his own testimony advocating it, because it was not in keeping with our American concept of freedom and the rights of citizens. He wrote, "Whenever I thought of the innocent little children who were torn from home, school friends, and congenial surroundings, I was conscience-stricken. It was wrong to react so impulsively without positive evidence of disloyalty." It seems that while the Japanese had been outside of Warren's scope of justice at the outset of World War II, after the war they had found their way into his scope of justice. Warren was not alone in expanding his scope of justice after the war, a topic that we'll return to in class. This flipped classroom video began by summarizing an interdisciplinary approach to studying injustice, looking to the mind sciences, to history, and to law. Based upon that approach, the video offered a pair of loose predictions regarding how salient injustices would tend to be rationalized or legitimated in practice. The balance of the video then examined whether those predictions do in fact help explain how three notorious historical injustices were, at the time they occurred, widely and mistakenly perceived as just. Those injustices were the Rosewood Massacre, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and Japanese internment.